Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Beth Strausser, and I work in the Policy Office in the Division of Institution and Award Support at the National Science Foundation. It is my pleasure to welcome you today to the Fall 2022 NSF Virtual Grants Conference. I am now pleased to present this Directorate for Social, Behavioral, and Economic Sciences session. Our distinguished speaker today is Dr. Jeremy Koster. So take it away, Jeremy.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another session here at the NSF Grants Conference. Today, we're talking about the Social, Behavioral, and Economic Sciences Directorate at NSF. SBE is an acronym that we often use for this directorate, and you'll hear me describe SBE programs throughout the slides today. My name is Jeremy Koster. I'm a program officer in my second year at NSF with a variety of responsibilities in SBE, including programs like cultural anthropology, human environment and geographical sciences, strengthening American infrastructure, as well as a number of cross-directorate activities where SBE is partnering with some of the other directorates around the Foundation for Interdisciplinary Research. Now, to orient you a little bit, there are, within the overall NSF umbrella, there's a number of different directorates. You can see SBE highlighted here, but we work well and collaborate frequently with our colleagues in other disciplines, other directorates that you see here depicted on the slide. Now, in general, SBE is broad, and it's hard to put just a few descriptors on a single slide, but the general orientation of SBE programs and sciences tends to focus on human behavior, psychology and cognition, social organizations, economics, etc. And the focus, as with most programs at NSF, is on basic science. And so using science to develop and employ rigorous methods to discover fundamental principles of human behavior and cognition. And that really goes from multiple levels. And so there are programs that look at molecular anthropology all the way up to much broader scales. Now, that's going to be the primary focus of the talk, those funding programs. But I also want to give a nod to collaborators in NCSES, the National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics. This is one of multiple government statistical agencies. This one focused in particular on measuring STEM-related outcomes, so science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and trying to track career trends and other measures that inform the kinds of work that NSF is doing in terms of supporting scientific communities throughout the United States and elsewhere. So, in terms of how SBE is organized, there's a bit of a hierarchy there, right? Where so I'm in the Division of Behavioral and Cognitive Sciences in the lower left. This is where a lot of the programs that I'm going to be talking about are housed, as well as our counterparts in the Division of Social and Economic Sciences, SES. There's a lot of acronyms. We can use the chat if you need any reminders. If I use acronyms and you can't remember specifically what the slides are, feel free to ask for clarifications and reminders. You can see SES depicted there as well. But also in our front office, there is an Office of Multidisciplinary Activities, and some of the programs that I'll be discussing are administered and supervised by colleagues in SMA. There's a compelling website. You can see the link here. We call it NSF by the numbers, and you can go and follow this website and learn a lot about funding trends over time. You can you'll see here on this slide I pulled out figures and statistics related to funding decisions made in fiscal year 2021. The database goes farther back than that, if you'd like to explore how some of those trends have varied over time. But to give you a sense of, SBE's general orientation, you can see in 1 year, a $250 million budget is about the norm. There were a number of proposals that were reviewed by the SBE Directorate, a funding rate of approximately 23% out of the nearly 4,000 proposals that we received. The average award size is about 277,000. Though, of course, as with averages in general, sometimes that's only part of the picture, and the actual amounts can be smaller, it can be bigger. These will include, for example, dissertation proposals. I'll talk about dissertation proposals as we go, but those tend to be, for example, smaller. Some of the larger collaborative awards, multi-investigator awards, multi-institutionals, those can be significantly larger than the average. Now, in terms of some of the funding programs that are many of the programs on this particular slide, I should say, are standing programs. These have been programs that have been around. Many of them might already be familiar to you. If you look at the economics program, the sociology program, et cetera, those have been standing programs for quite some time. And, I will talk briefly about those. It's perhaps worth mentioning that in some cases, we've seen fairly recent divisions. For example, security and preparedness, accountable institutions and behavior. Those are relatively new. They tend to attract, among other things, political science proposals that used to be reviewed by a preceding program in SBE. Now, I've also starred with an asterisk a number of the programs that run doctoral dissertation research improvement grant competition, DDRI, yet one more acronym. And if you are supporting students, or if you're in a position to support graduate students who might benefit from independent funding, you might take a special note of those programs, because often there will be separate solicitations, separate proposal requirements that are specifically geared towards helping students outline their projects and potentially receive funding there. I will say briefly that in some cases, even in cases where a program is not designated as supporting DDRI grants, sometimes there are situations where the program maybe helps another organization administer dissertation funding. Sociology, for example, supports via a grant to another organization dissertation research, although they don't administer the peer review process themselves. So there is some variation there that is worth noting, in particular for supporting students. So those are the programs in the SES division. The division where I work, Behavioral and Cognitive Sciences, BCS, is another division underneath the umbrella. And I have firsthand experience with cultural anthropology, human environment and geographical sciences, and strengthening American infrastructure. So I'm particularly able to talk about those programs, but have a fair bit of experience with a number of the other programs, and regularly interact with my colleagues. So please don't be shy about entering questions into the chat or Q&A about those as well. So again, you can see a number of programs here. Also support doctoral dissertation research improvement grants. We'll talk about those, as well as some of the other mechanisms that these programs feature, many of which have a variety of things that are specific to the discipline and the types of research that characterize the respective disciplines. Now, On this slide, I've briefly highlighted human networks and data science and strengthening American infrastructure. I mentioned previously that there are a number of standing programs in the respective divisions, but these two that I've highlighted are some of the newer programs, maybe not previously on your radar. And so I'm going to take a few moments to talk about the orientation of those programs and the kinds of research that they are designed to support. So starting with human networks and data science, you can see on the header to the slide, the leveraging data and network science, including geospatial data and infrastructure. So to some extent, this program emerged in response to the increasing availability of so-called big data and the kinds of research questions that can be answered fruitfully with bigger data sets than had characterized previous generations of scholarship in SBE disciplines. Now, an interesting feature of HANDS is that it's designed specifically to be, it has a co-funding model. Now, you can see the two tracks here. There's HANDS, we call it HANDS as the acronym. There's HANDS infrastructure. Often those projects are reviewed as standalone proposals, and they're designed specifically to support the development of infrastructure broadly defined that can advance the use of large data resources and analysis. That's one track. The track another track that we see pretty regularly is the HANDS research track. Now, you can see from the description that it's designed to advance theory in a core SBE discipline by the application of data and network science methods. So if you were to click, for example, on the solicitation, and a little bit of orientation here, when you see it on the slide where it says view guidelines, and then it has a number followed by a hyphen and then three more numbers. That is the solicitation number. You can search online NSF and 22-505, and that'll bring you pretty much directly to the HANDS solicitation. So the quote there that says the HANDS-R program will co-review and co-fund projects with other SBE programs is highlighted prominently on the HANDS website. Now, this is relevant because to some extent, in many cases, these co-funded projects are designed for researchers who maybe have, to some extent, a proposal or a project that resembles sort of common research designs that characterize that discipline, and they're looking to make further advances by incorporating a big data, data science, data analytics kind of component to the project. And it's in that space where HANDS funding can often catalyze and support some of those extra efforts to really increase the impacts, increase the potential inferences that can be drawn from a project that, yes, definitely has a big data science component to it, but nevertheless is advancing theory and answering important questions, the programmatic objectives of the different programs that you saw previously on the slides, the SBE programs, economics, sociology, anthropology, et cetera. If you want to find out more about the Human Networks and Data Science program, you can see that there's also a link down at the bottom to the program homepage. And then capitalizing on the Zoom environment, it's been common for the last few years for program officers to share webinars, to essentially record webinars where they talk about the specifics of the programs, the programmatic objectives, the kinds of things that principal investigators and researchers and support staff need to be contemplating as they assemble and advance proposals for review to those programs. And so if you follow that link, the webinar link for HANDS provides a really compelling overview of the HANDS program. Another one that I want to mention briefly is the Strengthening American Infrastructure program. We call it SAI. And to some extent, this is use-inspired research, as some of my colleagues might say. Human-centered interdisciplinary research on infrastructure, broadly defined. Now, with infrastructure, we get a number of questions, what counts as infrastructure? And it can be, yes, bridges and roads, but it can also be things like cyber infrastructure and supporting cybersecurity and a number of different possibilities in terms of how people are using technology, built environments, other aspects of infrastructure in their lives. And so a key goal of the SAI program is to infuse some of these debates or some of these efforts with disciplinary expertise from SBE perspectives. The idea being that, whether it's sociology or, political science perspectives, geography, whatever the orientation, that often that there's real potential for SBE perspectives to reframe debates and reframe applications and implementations of infrastructure in ways that reflect that the variation in human reasoning, decision-making, governance, et cetera. And so these are really exciting grants. Often they have interdisciplinary teams. For instance, SBE researchers partnering with investigators from other disciplines, whether that be engineering, our colleagues in information technology, computer engineering, bio. There's a number of interesting possibilities that have already come up in the short time that this program has been running. It does have a few tracks here, as you can see. Research grants are the main priority, and those are up to $750,000. The planning grants are, I'll go ahead and say they had a key role with the advent of this program. They're being somewhat de-emphasized, and it's possible that the new solicitation will remove that possibility. So as you look at this slide, I encourage you to focus in particular on the possibility for research grants, and the guidelines on the webpage will provide some additional insights about those. Now, if you remember that opening slide about how SBE is organized, you might remember that there's the Office of Multidisciplinary Activities, and they run a few really compelling programs as well, some competitive grant programs. I'm going to take a moment to highlight Build and Broaden. Sometimes we call it B2. And this particular program is designed to support fundamental research in the SBE sciences by researchers and investigations, in particular at minority serving institutions, MSIs. There are lists that are maintained of the institutions that are categorized as an MSI. I don't have a link here, but that's something that we could follow up on in the chat perhaps. But with these proposals, we see different kinds of things different kinds of proposals that resonate with the B2 priorities. You can see, for example, a straightforward one is for a researcher who works for an MSI to be the lead on submitting a proposal for consideration. These are, in terms of their disciplinary orientation, fairly wide open. There's no restriction that they have to fit any particular program within SBE. So a few examples: sociologists can apply for this, cognitive scientists can apply for this, social psychologists, economists, et cetera. Pretty much the full gamut of SBE disciplines are welcomed to submit proposals for the B2 competition. So, certainly the single principal investigator submitting a proposal, that's a fairly straightforward one. There can be collaborations between PIs at multiple organizations, multiple MSIs, but then also some proposals that we receive are those where principal investigators who are not affiliated with an MSI are collaborating with colleagues and co-PIs, senior personnel who are based at an MSI. In that latter case, you can see on the slide that as a primary goal of the work, there needs to be some discussion of how the project will foster research partnerships and especially capacity building at the collaborating MSI. There's a lot of potential questions on this, and you can see the email address where you can reach out to program officers who can help answer questions you might have and provide additional guidance for submitting proposals to the Build and Broaden program. The OMA, the Office of Multidisciplinary Activities, also administers the SBE Postdoctoral Research Fellowship Program. Now, this is a unique program that is specifically designed to help recent doctoral graduates, move to a different program, a different institution, I'd say, and to partner with a new mentor who is providing some general career mentorship and guidance in the next stage of their respective careers. And you can see that relationship needs to be formalized in advance of submitting the proposal. But nevertheless, the funding for the program comes from NSF, and so this is not contingent on the availability of funding through the institution. Salary support and other aspects of the program are provided via the SBE program, the SPRF. I mention this in part because this is, if you are, for example, working in a sponsored research office, this is perhaps a different kind of award where the funding isn't necessarily going into bins at your respective institutions, the way it might with some of our with the other standard grants offered by NSF. But nevertheless, chances are there might be some recent doctoral grads at your institutions who would benefit from some guidance as they navigate the process of submitting proposals to this competition. I do want to highlight briefly that there's a track that is specifically designed to support broadening participation initiatives at NSF as we seek to provide and support a diverse workplace, a diverse set of scholars going forward in SBE disciplines. Shifting gears briefly. If you were to click on the SBE Directorate, you'll quickly discern that SBE is involved in a number of cross-directorate initiatives and programs. Sometimes we call these cross-cutting programs. These are situations where multiple directorates are partnering to sponsor a particular interdisciplinary research program, a competitive program that in many ways looks like some of the standing programs, for example, in SBE. But in this case, they're typically administered by a group of interdisciplinary program officers. So I'll go ahead and mention, I'm on the DISIS, the Dynamics of Integrated Socio-Environmental Systems program. I'm going to talk about that briefly. There's a working group of 9 program officers who come from multiple directorates to work together to organize the review process, support funding decisions, et cetera. These are noteworthy because they do have a freestanding review process. The proposals go into a separate, call it a bin, and they are evaluated alongside each other. The interdisciplinary working groups, the program director teams, organize interdisciplinary reviewers, interdisciplinary panelists who bring their respective expertise and evaluate these specifically designed interdisciplinary proposals alongside one another. I've given 6 examples here on the slide. I'm going to talk about a couple of those in depth, but this is by no means an exhaustive list of all the different cross-cutting, cross-directorate initiatives at NSF. So to give you a bit of an orientation to how these work, I want to talk about the DICES program. So this program, it grew out of a former program called Coupled Natural and Human Systems, CNH is what we called it. It has gone through some rethinking, slight shifts in the programmatic objectives, and now called the Dynamics of Integrated Socio-Environmental Systems. And so in this case, there are 3 directorates that partner on this. SBE, 1, joined by our colleagues in geosciences and the biological sciences directorates. And so there's 9 program officers. I'm joined by 8 colleagues, 6 of whom come from non-SBE disciplines. And that orientation around interdisciplinarity is reflected in part in the ways that research teams are composed and the research questions that they propose to answer. So it's not uncommon, for example, for a geologist to work with an ecologist and to work with a geographer, among other personnel, and to propose a multi-year study. You can see the budget maximum of 1.6 million. That supports often longitudinal work. Sometimes these are based in particular locations. If there's a compelling reason to study how humans and the environment are varying and interacting in a particular location, the interdisciplinary teams might focus their attention on that particular location, leveraging methods and theory from multiple disciplines to look at the processes and feedbacks between the human and environmental components of a system. So these are, frankly, some of the most exciting proposals that we see at NSF. Certainly worth checking out the webpage if you have SBE researchers who are oriented towards studying human environment kinds of interactions. There are, in general, the main focus of that program is on funded basic research. I want to briefly highlight, as you see on the slide here, the research coordination networks. We call them RCN proposals. These are not necessarily oriented towards doing basic work in terms of data collection and analysis, but are funded at lower amounts to bring together and catalyze new teams as they work through, basically some of the principles and working out the methods that might be needed to tackle projects subsequently using innovative cross-disciplinary methods and theories. Research coordination networks are by no means exclusive to the DICES program, but they certainly are. The DICES program has featured some of the more synthetic and compelling teams that we've seen through that program. I want to briefly highlight a program like Signals in the Soil. So in this case, Signals in the Soil has existed as a program for quite some time. Recently, though, they added what they call a new pillar focused on socializing soil. And this is, you might think of it as a way that SBE perspectives can inform and contribute to debates in soil science. in general. And that might include, for example, the ways that human cognition and behavior around soils varies from culture to culture or place to place. And there's, for a variety of reasons, an emphasis at the National Science Foundation on understanding variation in what you might call traditional ecological knowledge. The ways that people think about the natural environment that might be similar or different from the ways that scientists in the respective disciplines think about the same environmental factors. And often we find that there's real benefits to understanding those similarities and differences in terms of helping and advance the science and giving new ideas to understand principles of the natural world, as well as having a strong environmental justice component in many cases. And so with that, the socializing soil pillar has catalyzed some new kinds of collaborations, some new kinds of research projects. We do have SBE scientists joining that working group and helping to administer the competitions. And again, this is a case where you can follow the links to look at the solicitations and the programmatic objectives of, in this case, signals in the soil. Now, I've already highlighted a number of these respective mechanisms previously. The DDRIG competitions, doctoral dissertation research improvement grants, those tend to be, shorter term grants, 1 or 2 years, often for less than, $25,000 or $30,000 in direct costs. Some of the other awards that we see, I want to highlight rapid awards briefly. Rapid awards are unique at NSF in the sense that they don't necessarily need to go through, the full review process that characterizes the peer review process evaluations at NSF more generally. The reason for these awards is because there may be a real opportunity for what we call ephemeral data collection, data that are compelling and answer important research questions and contribute to theory in the respective disciplines, but with a time sensitivity that might not be, you might not be able to wait, for example, 6 to 8 or 10 months to get a project going and count on getting the data that are needed to answer some of those questions. And so the rapid awards are designed for principal investigators to be able to reach out directly to program officers to explain what kinds of projects that they have in mind, have a preliminary conversation, and through that, NSF can respond whether they see the case for ephemerality that would subsequently prompt a rapid proposal submission. Now, there's got to be a very clear case for ephemerality. We generally like our peer review process, and we prefer when we can do that. But the rapid does provide a mechanism for, as in the acronym, a rapid infusion of funding to tackle time-sensitive problems. The career program. Now, this is basically NSF-wide. So there's career awards in SBE, geosciences, SCIES, all the directorates, to my knowledge, have career awards in some capacity or another. These are, they have their own separate solicitation, and you'll see that they are designed in particular for early career researchers, usually assistant professors before they go up for tenure. In addition to outlining a substantive program, a research project that they're going to tackle over a period of a few years, there's also a noteworthy educational component. In other words, there needs to be some discussion in these proposals about how investigators are going to leverage their expertise and contribute to educational goals broadly defined. We're not overly prescriptive about what that needs to look like, but there does need to be a lot of thought given by the investigators to that particular educational component. Now, one thing about these career awards is that there's not a separate line of funding to support these. These are supported through the standing programs that you've seen previously. So, for example, I work for the Human Environment and Geographical Sciences program. A proposal submitted to the career program is initially reviewed by staff working for the career, but then it is subsequently routed to have the review process administered by a standing program like HEGS. And so that's where it's important for researchers to know in advance which program is the most logical home for their career proposal, so that they can orient their proposal and its objectives around the programmatic guidelines. And so definitely, if you're in a role where you're supporting researchers, make sure that that's on their radar fairly early in the process. I want to briefly highlight the mid-career advancement the program as well. We call it the MCA program. And this is a case where, for the most part, associate professors, maybe a few other tenured individuals can, in light of the changing expectations about, for example, service expectations by associate professors, often their career goes through some challenges as they try to keep a thriving research program going. And the mid-career advancement program is really compelling as an opportunity for those individuals to often to partner or mentor with researchers elsewhere who can provide some guidance, some expertise, some coaching, some instruction in methods, for example, that could really catalyze a relaunch of sorts by those mid-career researchers. I will say that the case for what the funding can do has to be fairly strong. I think it's fair to say that most researchers can benefit from having time off from teaching and service, but NSF is really looking in particular for how a grant is going to make possible additional developments, additional steps in the career beyond just providing the time. So that's an important consideration if you are proposing a mid-career advancement or supporting an MCA grant submission. Now, as you are evaluating the options for finding funding at NSF, there's a few resources, many of which are housed on our website. I'll show you the example of the funding search website here on a few subsequent slides. We also have an awards database that you can use. I'll show you that. I do encourage you all to sign up for email notifications and newsletters. There are opportunities to be on the listserv that sends all new announcements, and those can be funding announcements. Those can be Dear Colleague letters. They can be announcements about webinars and when program officers are holding open office hours. So there's a number of different ways to find out about NSF funding opportunities. One of those is the new funding search tool. You can see the website /funding/ opportunities. And when you get to that website, you'll see something that looks like what you see here. And you have the option of clicking on opportunities that are related to a particular directorate. So in the lower left, you can filter on SBE as one of those. You can also, as you see here, use the funding search tool, so you can type in strings, keywords into the search tool and see what comes back from that. If you were to click on SBE, you'll find out that there's a number of programs listed, including some of the cross-directorate activities that I've listed previously. So if SBE is involved in a program, even if it's supported by multiple directorates, it will show up on the list of programs that come back when you filter on SBE. Now, when you get to the results page, this is an example. Our colleagues in security and preparedness, they look at political science, often with an international orientation. You can see that a brief description is often associated with each of the programs that comes up on the web page. From the website tool, the search page, you can click on the links and it will take you, in this case, if you hit the link there that's highlighted, it will take you to the security and preparedness webpage where you can find out more details, often reading the solicitations that are associated with the programs. Once you are on that program webpage, there's going to be a number of key details. You can see, you find out when proposals are due. There's a difference, by the way, between a deadline and a target date. The latter often provides a little bit of flexibility. And if you want to find out more about that, one way to learn more is by contacting, emailing in particular, the program directors. And so you can see here for this program, my colleagues Paul and Lee are currently the program directors. We are public servants, and so we strive to make ourselves available to interested researchers, other staff at funded organizations. Reach out to us as often as you need to get the guidance you need to learn about the expectations and the guidelines for submitting proposals. You can often, on that webpage as well, click on a link that says "Browse projects funded by this program." Now that will take you to another resource at NSF, the awards database. Now, if you go straight to the awards database, you'll have the option of supplying a number of different kinds of data that will bring up a list of awards. I will go ahead and say this. There's a trade-off here with this webpage that is, on the one hand, comprehensive and allows you to enter the database in multiple ways by, for example, looking up programs, looking at program officers, looking up reference codes, keywords. You can look up active awards. You can look up expired awards. There's a lot of different ways to get into the database. The trade-off is that it might look a little intimidating at first. If in doubt, again, reach out to program officers. There's a number of different ways we can assist. So, for example, if you were interested in looking at all of the cultural anthropology awards, I could tell you that the element code to supply is 1,390. You put that in the element code box, it will bring up just the awards that have been funded by cultural anthropology. So once you get into a list of those awards, meanwhile, you can click on the awards that come up. You'll see a big list, and it's often helpful to click through those to get a sense of the diversity of proposals and projects that are funded by a particular program. It's helping you determine if there's a good fit between the research you imagine and what a program's objectives and guidelines are. You can click further on each of those specific awards to get more details, including some details about funding amounts, start dates, etc. You'll also be able to read the abstract of the award. These abstracts are designed to convey details about the general science of the awards, the generalizable contributions that the funded research is making. And those can be a really helpful tool. I will note that we are not able to share the proposals themselves. NSF staff don't have the ability to do that. Technically, the proposals are subject to the Freedom of Information Act. Nevertheless, one thing I'd say is that whereas NSF staff might not be able to share, in some cases, if you reach out to the investigators who are listed on the awards page, they're fully free to share drafts of their proposals. And we find that often scientists are eager to help their peers, and they might be willing to share at least key parts of the proposal that could help you. Now, I want to take a moment to discuss the code review process. Now, when you submit a proposal to NSF, it's tagged to go to one particular program. That said, there are options in many cases, not always, but in many cases, for a code review, where, for example, maybe the decision risk and management sciences program reviews a proposal alongside a review by social psychology. If you are interested in having that sort of code review setup, you can do it in a couple of ways. You can mark on the cover page the programs that you think are most appropriate to review, and you can select multiple programs. That will get flagged and noticed by program officers. There's also opportunities for program officers to initiate a code review as well. So when proposals come in, perhaps I read that proposal and I realize, oh, there's actually a lot of overlap with program X, and then I exchange some correspondence with the directors of that program, and they can then decide if a code review seems appropriate to them as well. Now, when there's code review, they essentially operate in parallel in most cases, where, using the previous example, DRMS will have a panel. It will review the proposal. Meanwhile, a separate social psychology panel will review the proposal, and each will provide their feedback and their evaluation. Using that information and recommendation, the respective programs can decide among the possible outcomes. In some cases, both programs think it's a good fit and a competitive proposal that merits funding, and they both contribute toward the funding of that proposal. If one proposal views it as competitive and another doesn't, that's okay. The program that wants to support that has that opportunity even without joint funding from another program. And then, of course, in some cases, neither program would view the proposal as a competitive proposal. So in general, we do a lot of code review at NSF. Our view is that these multiple perspectives ultimately lead to better science. We are also always eager to make sure that we are supporting strong science that maybe is in the interstitial spaces, the interdisciplinary spaces between some of our standing programs. And a code review mechanism is one way to achieve that goal of supporting the best SBE science. So before you apply, I've highlighted the solicitation in multiple cases, right? I pointed out, for example, the links on the DICE's webpage that you can click and follow and read all about the orientation and the requirements of DICE's or any of the other programs that make their solicitations available on the webpage. Alongside those solicitations, though, all proposals need to follow the outlines and the requirements of, we call it the PAPG, the Proposal and Award Policies and Procedures Guide. And with that, you'll find that there are certain required elements in all NSF proposals. I'll highlight the data management plan as just one example of those. SBE proposals, like those to other directorates, feature a data management plan. Postdoctoral mentoring plan, we want to see biographical sketches in the appropriate format, current and pending forms related to funding. All those things are outlined in the PAPG. So once you've narrow down some of the questions. Maybe you've identified a program that you're going to target. A common practice is for would-be principal investigators to reach out to a program director with a 1 or 2 page summary. So I work for the Human Environment and Geographical Sciences program, for instance, and it's common for principal investigators to send us a 1 or 2 page concept note that outlines the research question, why it matters, a little background on what literature, what theory the proposed project is speaking to, some ideas of data collection and methods, sampling strategy for empirical data collection, an analytical plan on how the questions are going to be answered, and focusing also on questions of broader impacts. What are the broader impacts of the proposed work? With that summary, we can provide feedback to the principal investigator as an early step, informally, to assess fit between what the investigators have in mind and the HEGS programmatic objectives. That kind of correspondence is common for all SBE programs, and so please don't hesitate to reach out at an early stage to get that feedback from program directors. I will say briefly, if you are interested in multiple programs, you can include them all in a single email. Even if you're just targeting one program, if you see on the webpage that there are multiple program directors, go ahead and include everybody on that email. This is very normative for NSF programs to have this collaborative correspondence. Now, a few pitfalls to avoid. We really highlight the generalizability of projects. We don't have the ability to fund all of the compelling work that investigators have in mind. And so when there are projects that are proposed that generalize broadly about important research questions in the respective disciplines and interdisciplinary work, those generalizable contributions often rise to the top in terms of funding priorities. Some pitfalls to avoid, details about methods and analysis are really important to understand and convey how the evidence is going to be assembled and looked at and interpreted in ways that can answer the research questions that motivated the proposal. Making a compelling case for feasibility is important. And then there's going to be some specifics that relate to each of the programs. Some are cross-directorate, some are oriented towards disciplinary research. And being mindful of that as you put together a proposal, making sure that terms are defined clearly, that constructs are operationalized clearly, that's an important part of NSF proposals. And so I've mentioned them previously, but intellectual merit and broader impacts, these are the 2 pillars by which NSF proposals are evaluated. You want to be sure to address both thoroughly and compellingly in your respective proposals. Regarding broader impacts, we do get a number of questions about this to the point that SBE as a directorate released a Dear Colleague letter, and I've linked it here, that specifically addresses aspects of broader impacts in SBE funded work. Probably the main thing to remember is that there's no one size fits all kind of model to broader impacts. There's no sense that you have to have broader impacts that look exactly the same from one proposal to another. In other words, we encourage researchers to read this document, to get a sense of SBE's priorities regarding broader impacts, and then to be free thinking and open-minded about the different ways that they can leverage their projects to achieve broader impacts and meet those goals broadly defined. And so with that, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention, for being here, supporting science in general. I'm more than happy to start fielding questions. If you add in some Q&A, often it's helpful. if you provide a little background about the orientation that you have in terms of, what kind of role you fill in the overall scientific process. I'm certainly excited about answering questions here, but if you have questions subsequently, I do want to highlight my email address. I'm more than happy to field correspondence related to any of the points that we've discussed. I can also, in some cases, if you email, I might be able to point you in the direction of other NSF colleagues who can share perspectives about SBE and its funding priorities and overall guidelines going forward. So thank you again, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay. All right. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jeremy, for that excellent presentation. And so we have a bunch of questions, wonderful questions that have come in from the audience. So, and we have about 15 minutes, a little bit more to answer those. So yeah, so let's get right to it. There were some questions that came in about postbacks. So the first one is, will NSF support postback positions in proposals for SBE, as part of the proposal, not as the aim of the whole proposal?
Right, and so you can imagine proposals for projects that involve, recent graduates in various aspects, including data collection, data coding, running lab experiments, whatever it might be. There's potentially variation across programs, but in general, the answer is an emphatic yes, that, if there's, especially if there's a real opportunity for a healthy educational experience for those recent graduates, that's probably going to be looked on very favorably. If there is careful consideration to the mentoring of that student and perhaps a trajectory off to graduate school subsequently, yes, I can say that kind of consideration, including budgetary considerations, tends to be reviewed reasonably favorably in many SBE programs.
Great. Okay. All right. And kind of following on from that, another person asked, can a postdoc be a PI?
I do know of situations where postdocs have been the PI. Now, the important caveat here is that NSF proposals are submitted by eligible organizations, and it's ultimately up to the organization to determine who they feel comfortable nominating as a PI to manage that project. So there's been variation. Some are just give sort of a hands-off and let the PI be a postdoc. Sometimes they want some sort of collaborative arrangement where a faculty member is a co-PI or a PI, and then the postdoc would be the co-PI. There's a variety of possibilities there. As always, it's helpful to talk with the sponsored research office at the organization, as well as communicate in advance with NSF program officers.
Okay, great. All right, thank you. So the next question is about, somebody was asking that they're a political scientist working on a proposal with a GIS specialist in their geophysics department. And they're looking at developing tools on energy equity. So which group do you think would be a good match for them?
Wow, that's a good question. So I do some work with the Human Environment and Geographical Sciences program, and so the GIS, the geographic components, might be a fit there. From what I'm hearing in that description, I'm also cluing into some possibilities like the political science programs, the security and preparedness. AIB is another one. DRMS, Decision Risk and Management Science, might be a possibility as well. But I just want to take a general opportunity to highlight that this is an opportunity to draft that 1 or 2 page summary that I described in the presentation. And you can submit that simultaneously to any program that seems like it might be a possible fit. And you can write, dear Dr. So-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so, and have a list of 6 possibilities there, all from different programs, and say, I'm not sure where this might fit. Can you give me some guidance? And then there will be a collaborative conferral and sort of feedback provided to help you identify possible fits of that particular topic and proposal.
Okay, that's great. That's great advice. I think I'm going to ask this next question from Karen Chen, because I think it's kind of in the same vein as the last one. So she's asking, when would be a good timing to decide co-review, and can she reach out to the program director to inquire about co-review suggestions at an early stage? Should she send that one-page summary that you were talking about?
Yeah, thanks, Beth, and thanks for the question, Karen. So it's somewhat of an organic process in terms of how co-review is managed. We certainly welcome those initial queries, where you can send that 1 or 2 page summary to multiple programs simultaneously and ask, hey, does this seem like a good fit for your respective programs? Could co-review be a possibility? Ultimately, when the proposal comes in, we'll also, again, take a look at it. And sometimes co-review is going to be initiated by us, and we identify possibilities for co-review. But even if you haven't lined up something in advance, there's 2 things to mention. A, you can, on the cover sheet, when you submit to research.gov, there's a slot for you to identify programs. You can identify at that stage multiple programs that might be ripe for co-review. You can also suggest it informally. So if you submit a proposal, maybe you've even forgotten to designate multiples. To whatever program you submit it, you can reach out to those program officers and say, I just submitted a proposal. I wanted to alert you that it seems like it might be a good fit for other program X. And, at that point, we would have some internal conversations to see if co-review might be appropriate. Co-review is not always, it's up to the discretion of the respective program to determine if co-review is appropriate or worthwhile. And so, we, of course, welcome the suggestions, but I do want to say that it is a bit of an informal process where programs are identifying fit between proposals and their programmatic objectives.
Great. Very good. All right. Okay. So going back to switching gears a little bit, going back to the postdoc. So somebody had asked, on average, how many SBE postdoc applications do you receive? I'm assuming they're talking about postdoctoral fellowship applications.
So there is a separate SBE postdoctoral fellowship program, and it's a great program. We're super proud of it. It's a bit unusual in that whereas most NSF awards are made to organizations, these awards are made directly to the individuals who apply. I wish I could answer this more fully. 2 things: we don't actually publish the numbers of proposals that we receive. Second, it's not. I don't actually have firsthand experience managing that program, so I couldn't even give you an informal estimate. My hunch is, well, I won't even share a hunch. Let me backtrack and say, if you want a little bit of guidance, this is a time when you might reach out to directly to the program officers who manage that program. They're going to be listed on the program webpage alongside their email addresses. A quick email describing some of your background and your general question is going to be received favorably.
Okay. All right. Great. And actually, so this next question that it might be, we'll see, you had said, it's not your program that you manage, so they may need to reach out to the program officers as you suggested. But in any case, somebody had asked about the SBE postdoc fellowships. How do they add a second mentor from the same institution? So according to the newest program solicitation, the postdoctoral mentoring plans are not applicable. However, an FAQ. So I guess this is 2 questions in one. So one is adding a second mentor, and then the other question is the FAQ recommends a postdoctoral mentoring plan. So it seems like there's some, potentially
potential
conflicting
I understand. Yeah,
information.
Thanks for the question, Beth. I do know that the postdoctoral research fellowship has gone through some recent iterations, and some new guidelines have been published just recently, or they'll be forthcoming imminently. So this is a case where I'm hesitant to speak too clearly about these new guidelines. I'm not managing this program myself. I can say that in principle, there's going to be, I'm optimistic that there's going to be a way where that second mentor could be identified, whether that's in the project description, whether that's through a letter of collaboration, whether it's in the postdoctoral mentoring plan. I'm not entirely sure, but in general, proposals are meant to convey what the vision for the proposed work is going to entail. And if a second mentor is a key part of that, we would welcome that kind of detail one way or another.
Okay, all right, great. And right, and then the second question about the postdoctoral mentoring plan, again, it sounds like they should probably reach out to the program officers to to get that clarified, basically.
Right, exactly. Yeah, we're public servants. Yeah. We welcome the emails. We're happy to help you do the best proposal you can.
Great. All right. Thank you. So there's one other question about the postdoctoral fellowship. Again, well, I think I can answer part of it, but we'll see with their other questions. So for the fellowships, if they're using existing data with two collaborators from the same institution, should those collaborators submit a letter of collaboration in the proposal?
Chances are there's going to be some option to either co-sign a single letter of collaboration, or I believe the system will allow multiple letters of collaboration. The main thing about those letters of collaboration is that they're not meant to be letters of recommendation. They're just meant to say, as described in the proposal, if this proposal is funded, I will be involved in the ways that were described. And so that's the kind of thing where multiple slots can fill up. I've seen proposals for other programs where there's frankly over a dozen letters of collaboration. So I know the system can handle it. Reach out to the program officer. We support this.
Right. Okay, great. And yeah, and their follow on is it can multiple collaborators sign one letter, which you had just talked about. I would say, from a policy perspective, each collaborator, the way it's set up in the PAP guide, each collaborator it should be submitting their own letter. But talk to the program officer. I mean, if they want to allow multiple collaborators to sign one letter, then that's fine. So
great, thank you.
Okay, all right. Let's see. So Dean Gerstein asked a question about, this was back in the early part of the presentation, we were talking about mean award size for SBE. And so they're saying, that's heavily affected by a few big outliers. So they're interested in what is the median award size?
So in response to that, certainly the difference between the medians and the means is going to be salient here, especially for SBE, which funds a number of doctoral dissertation awards. I don't have the median close at hand. I don't know if the awards dashboard will provide this in an easy summary, but you're also welcome to go to the NSF awards database, and you would have the option of downloading every single award that has come out of the SBE directorate for your own calculations. It is an interesting question.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Great. All right. So let's go to a question from my good friend, Susan Ferrari. She was saying that the conventional wisdom amongst grants officers at PUIs is that, they don't see a lot of grants to their faculty from SBE. And she's also heard that, NSF program officers, they don't necessarily get as many proposals from the PUI faculty as they would like. So she's interested in, what are some of the opportunities to partner better engage PIs from that sector?
So I absolutely want to signal we welcome proposals that come to us from predominantly undergraduate institutions. We don't have a whole lot of levers that we can mobilized to draw in those proposals. One thing I would say, though, is that we're always eager to involve researchers in the evaluation process as well. And so if you have faculty members at your institutions, for instance, who would be interested and willing to provide reviews or serve as a panelist on a review panel, sometimes that can be a really useful way for faculty members to get a sense of what the NSF evaluation process is like, and might spur some ideas for subsequent proposals that they have in mind themselves. So that's the first idea that comes to mind. Again, we're public servants. Please have your employees reach out to us, and we're happy to talk ideas.
Okay, great. All right. And the next question is from Agnitra, and it has to do with the career program. So they're asking, can this be in collaboration with someone in an early stage career?
Mm-hmm. So it's normative for career proposals to have a single principal investigator, but often those projects themselves can be collaborative in many ways. And so it's going to be program specific to some extent. It's hard to generalize across all the SBE programs, but this is a case where, again, communication with the program officers might highlight some opportunities to talk about those collaborations.
Great. All right. Somebody else is asking about RCNs and what kind of proposals are most successful, and what are some common pitfalls.
So an RCN, as a reminder, is a research coordination network. In many cases, these are most successful when they bring together researchers from different parts of the scientific topography to catalyze discussions that wouldn't happen any other way, right? And so often I see programs that really are eager to reward what you might call high risk, high reward RCN proposals, things that can galvanize and cross disciplinary lines in ways that we haven't seen previously. The pitfalls, by contrast, are RCNs tend to be less successful when a group of already established collaborators proposes to get together and agree more on things that they already share in common with their perspectives.
Okay, great. All right, thank you. Okay, so I am, let's see, we are almost at time. So I would say let's do, so the one from Janie Mitchell about HSI, PUI, I would suggest contacting a SBE program officer about that. And let's just do this one final one. Is there a place in the biosketch to list our awards or other accomplishments? They're not as familiar with the NSF biosketch format.
So there's a template for the biosketch that you can follow. And the idea behind the biosketch is to standardize things, to allow people to highlight five relevant products within a particular category, for instance. It's to level the playing field to some extent so that people who have, very long lists of papers and things really just highlight the ones that are most relevant. If you need any guidance on how to fill out that biosketch, this is again where you can check the PAPG, the proposal guide, that will have some details on that. And then as well, we share some templates that you can use. If you have any questions, of course, the ultimate recourse is to reach out to the program officers again.
Great. All right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Jeremy. And thanks everybody for joining us today. So thank you again, everybody, for participating. Thank you, Jeremy. And everybody have a wonderful rest of your day.